"Arrest her! She vandalized community property!" That's exactly what Elaine Collins shouted at the police while my wife stood there holding nothing more threatening than a brand new padlock. All Emily had done was swap out the corroded, useless lock on the gate to our lake cabin. Our gate. Our cabin. Somehow that tiny repair escalated into flashing lights, sirens bouncing off the water, and neighbors gawking at us like we were criminals. My stomach knotted. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity, and another part wanted to yell at the unfairness of it all. Tell me, what would you have done if your spouse got treated like a lawbreaker for fixing a lock? The morning couldn't have been more ordinary. Emily was on the deck sipping her coffee, sketching ideas for one of her student art projects, while I checked the gate that connects our land to the main lake road. That old lock had been clinging on for dear life, rusted and stubborn, ever. Since we inherited the cabin from my grandfather 6 months earlier, I'd been meaning to fix it, but like most weekend chores, it never made it to the top of my list. Emily finally had enough of wrestling with it every visit, so she ran into town, bought a simple replacement, and swapped it out. Nothing fancy, just a solid padlock that actually turned when you used the key. Meanwhile, I was inside making breakfast. Eggs sizzling, bacon popping, thinking maybe today I'd finally deal with that squeaky deck board that had been annoying. Us all summer, that's when I heard the sirens. Not one, not two, but 3 squad cars tore down our quiet road like they were chasing armed robbers. The sound bounced off the lake and through the pines, the kind of sound that drops a weight into your stomach. I stepped onto the porch and there was Emily, bewildered, standing by the gate with the old broken lock in one hand and the packaging from the new one in the other. And behind her, Elaine Collins, the HOA president, pointing dramatically at the gate as if Emily had spray-painted graffiti on a national monument. She was practically buzzing with righteous outrage, her arms flailing as she performed for the arriving officers, like a prosecutor putting on a show for a jury. Elaine accused Emily of damaging community property, shouting loud enough for the whole cove to hear, while Emily stood there clutching a $20 padlock like it was evidence from a heist. And now 3 police cruisers boxed her in, as if she'd just masterminded a crime spree, instead of fixing what amounted to routine wear and tear. I saw Emily's face turning red, not from fury, but from the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of half the neighborhood. In her hand was my grandfather's old rusted lock. Maybe she was thinking of the decades he spent caring for this place, never once subjected to this kind of petty, power-hungry harassment. The first officer to step out, Martinez, his name, Tag said, looked around with that expression cops get when they realize dispatch has sent them to something that didn't even remotely warrant emergency lights. He walked toward Elaine, who immediately launched into a breathless monologue about community safety and infrastructure destruction. She hadn't even let him open his mouth before declaring that Emily had endangered the entire neighborhood with her unauthorized lock replacement. I had to grab the porch railing just to steady myself. Was this woman really dragging the police into our lives over a lock from the hardware store? Emily looked at me with that classic wife look, the one that says, "You should have fixed this months ago, and now the universe is punishing us for your procrastination." Officer Martinez asked Elaine to clarify what actual crime had occurred. She pointed furiously at the locks like they were smoking guns, insisting Emily had no authority to alter shared infrastructure and that the HOA had never approved such modifications. Martinez glanced at the gate, then at Emily, then at me. You could see him silently wondering why 3 squad cars had been sent to referee an argument about a padlock. So I walked over, introduced myself, and explained that this was private property. The gate simply connected our cabin to the public road. Martinez asked for proof, so I went inside and dug out my grandfather's deed, the one from when we inherited the cabin last spring. It clearly marked the boundaries. The gate sat at least 10 feet within our property line. I handed it over, and the change in Elaine's face was instant. She tried backpedaling, insisting the gate served the entire community and therefore couldn't be changed without HOA permission. But by then, Martinez was already shaking his head. Another officer chimed in, explaining this was clearly an HOA civil dispute, not a criminal offense, and that dialing 911 for non-emergencies could even be considered abuse of emergency services. Elaine's face turned an alarming shade of purple as she realized her grand performance was falling flat. She doubled down, talking faster, demanding Emily's arrest. But the officers had checked out. They were done wasting time on neighborhood theatrics when real emergencies were waiting elsewhere. Martinez filed a report for formality's sake, noting no crime had been committed. Emily showed him the old lock, which literally fell apart when touched, and explained how it had barely worked for months. He documented that the replacement was clearly just routine maintenance, not vandalism or theft. When the cruisers finally pulled away, Elaine lingered in our driveway for another 10 minutes, ranting about HOA authority, while Emily and I exchanged that look, the one that says, "What exactly did we inherit along with this peaceful lake cabin?" Later that evening, I called my friend Sheriff Anderson to tell him the story. He burst out laughing, saying it sounded like dispatch had been fed an overblown tale, like replacing a rusty lock had been framed as some kind of criminal emergency. He advised me to submit a public records request for the 911 recording so I could hear for myself what story Elaine gave the dispatcher to justify sending out such a massive emergency response to what was clearly just a neighbor dispute. Figured it couldn't hurt to listen to exactly how she managed to turn a $20 hardware replacement into something that sounded like a crime scene requiring urgent police action. That call was clearly meant to get my wife arrested. Instead, it might end up being the evidence that takes Elaine down. The records came back faster than I expected, which in hindsight should have tipped me off to how seriously the county treats misuse of emergency services. Within 5 business days, I had a CD with the full recording and a transcript of Elaine's call. That evening, Emily and I sat at the kitchen table and listened to it 3 times before either of us said anything meaningful. Elaine told the dispatcher there was suspicious activity happening at the lake cabin. She claimed unknown people were tampering with security equipment and suggested multiple officers might be needed because it looked like vandalism of community property with tools. But there was something more buried in that call. Something that made Emily grab my arm the second time through. The dispatcher asked Elaine directly about her connection to the property and whether she had any personal stake in the situation. That's when Elaine mentioned Robert Collins from Lakefront Development Solutions, insisting that area development projects made property security a community-wide concern that required immediate police involvement. Emily looked at me with dawning realization as we both heard Elaine basically admit, on a recorded emergency line, that her motives weren't about neighborhood safety at all. She had let slip that her husband ran a construction company focused on luxury lake house and resort development. In other words, her 911 call was really about protecting their business interests, not public safety, and certainly not about a routine lock change on private land. Emily immediately started digging online for information about lakefront development solutions while I replayed the section where Elaine referred to specific projects planned for our shoreline. What we uncovered chilled us both. According to state business filings, Robert Collins had multiple large-scale developments scheduled for our stretch of the lake over the next 5 years. His company's model revolved around buying up clusters of properties and converting them into upscale resorts for wealthy tourists and corporate retreats. Their success depended on securing continuous sections of lakefront land to maximize profit and control. The most shocking part came when Emily looked into county zoning applications and recently filed permits. Lakefront Development Solutions had already submitted early plans for a massive resort that would cover several properties along our exact section of shoreline. The design required road access through what happened to be our gate, and the documents explicitly listed the old cabin property as critical for creating that access route. I stared across the table at Emily, realizing we had stumbled into something far bigger than an HOA power struggle over community rules. That weekend, we went back through my grandfather's old files in detail, searching for any clue about why our property held such unique importance for Robert Collins' multi-million-dollar project. Grandfather had been meticulous with his paperwork, and buried deep in his cabinet we found decades-old correspondence with the county planning office. Back in the early 1980s, when the lake was first being developed for residential use, our cabin had been granted special zoning protections. Those protections meant any future construction requiring road access had to build around our property, not force us to sell or move. The documents made it clear. The protections were permanent and ironclad. The real bombshell came when Emily uncovered Robert Collins's private business communications in the public records database. They showed him negotiating with potential investors and lake homeowners over the last 2 years. He'd been buying up properties for well above market value to clear the way for his resort. Every single owner had already sold, except us. Our cabin was the final holdout blocking his multi-million-dollar development. Emily printed everything she found and laid it across our kitchen table like an investigator preparing evidence for court, sorting it all by date and relevance to our land. From a business perspective, the project was undeniably ambitious. 200 luxury suites clustered around the lake, a championship golf course designed by a famous architect, and a marina for yachts and high-end boats. It was exactly the kind of sprawling development that would completely transform our quiet community into a high-priced tourist hub, pushing out long-time residents who'd been here for generations. I could understand why Robert Collins wanted our cabin so badly. What I couldn't understand was why Elaine thought calling 911 over a lock change would somehow pressure us into selling. That's when Emily pointed out something I had completely overlooked in the HOA records. Elaine Collins had become HOA president exactly 3 years ago, the very same time her husband's company began aggressively buying up lakefront properties from unsuspecting neighbors. Before becoming president of the HOA, Elaine had spent more than 2 decades working as a city clerk. That background meant she knew zoning codes and property rules inside and out, and how to wield official authority to pressure owners into compliance or push them toward selling. Emily's digging uncovered a disturbing pattern. Every family that had sold to Robert's company had first been hit with an intense wave of HOA enforcement, enough to make life so stressful that moving away seemed like the only relief. Elaine was taking advantage of her inside knowledge of city procedures, launching campaigns of harassment that looked like standard neighborhood protection, but were, in reality, designed to wear families down until they gave up their homes. What we were dealing with wasn't just ordinary HOA bickering over rules. We were the final obstacle standing between Elaine and a massive development payday. And she was fully prepared to weaponize emergency services themselves to clear the way for her husband's property grab. She didn't care about safety. She cared about profit. Monday morning came with the first official violation notice, hand-delivered, by Elaine herself at 7:30 while Emily and I were still sipping coffee in our robes. She stood on our porch with a clipboard and camera, snapping photos of the cabin as if she were gathering evidence for court. But the notice wasn't what I expected. It didn't mention the old lock complaint. Instead, it accused us of having deck railings below code and a shoreline fire pit that supposedly violated environmental protections, demanding immediate removal. Emily read it twice before realizing Elaine was inventing brand new violations as a pretext for harassment. I started to wonder if HOA boards could simply make up rules on the fly to target families they wanted gone. Tuesday brought the next escalation. As Emily headed out for her jog, she found 2 cars blocking our gate, cutting off all access to the road. Elaine was standing right there, arms folded, declaring that the HOA had put temporary traffic measures in place while violations were under review. When Emily asked how long we'd be trapped, Elaine coolly replied it depended on how quickly we cooperated with enforcement. Emily was so furious she called me outside rather than risk saying something she'd regret. I confronted Elaine, telling her straight out that blocking our driveway was trespassing and unlawful imprisonment, and that if she didn't move the cars immediately, she'd face legal consequences. She insisted the HOA had authority to control traffic during safety investigations, but couldn't produce a single document proving they could legally confine us on our own land. Emily began snapping photos of license plates while I called Sheriff Anderson to report the illegal blockade. It felt like Elaine was testing how far she could push before provoking us into overreacting, something she could twist into grounds for police involvement or even property seizure. By Wednesday, the harassment had taken on another form. Emily found a detailed fine notice taped to our front door demanding $3,700 in penalties for alleged violations. The list included supposed infractions like unauthorized gate changes, unsafe deck upkeep, improper shoreline use, and failing to respond to community concerns. When Emily called the number listed, she only reached a polished but automated service, no actual human representative. I began to suspect Elaine was fabricating debts to trap us under fake financial pressure until selling became the only way out. Thursday's escalation was all about isolating us. Elaine went door to door in our lakeside community, collecting signatures for a petition demanding immediate action against our cabin. At least a dozen families had signed, persuaded by her claim that our noncompliance threatened both their children and their investments. When Emily and I visited the signers, most admitted they had no clue what violations we were accused of. They had just trusted Elaine's supposed expertise. Emily finally hit her breaking point with Mrs. Patterson, our elderly neighbor, who sheepishly apologized for signing. Elaine had told her that our cabin was unsafe and might collapse into the lake during storms. Mrs. Patterson had known our family and this cabin for decades. She knew it was structurally sound. But Elaine had frightened her with detailed lies about foundation issues and roof damage. Emily lost it. She stood right there in Mrs. Patterson's driveway, furious that Elaine would scare an elderly neighbor with false safety claims about a property she'd never even inspected. She demanded to know what gave Elaine the right to terrorize people with made-up hazards. That night, Emily organized our growing stack of evidence while I tried to understand the legal stakes of what was happening. By then, we had documentation of false violation notices, illegal blockades, fabricated fines, and deliberate lies spread to vulnerable neighbors. Emily said it was time to call in an attorney because Elaine's tactics were no longer petty disputes. They were systematic criminal harassment aimed at forcing us to surrender our property through fear rather than a fair sale. I agreed this situation had gone well past ordinary HOA squabbles and now demanded real legal action to safeguard our family's inheritance. That evening, Sheriff Anderson called with troubling information about Elaine's escalating harassment tactics and her calculated violations of HOA rules aimed at pressuring property owners across the lake community. He explained his office had been getting similar complaints for the past 2 years, but most families gave up, selling their homes rather than enduring drawn-out legal fights against coordinated harassment from the HOA. He warned us to expect things to intensify since Elaine clearly knew that intimidation worked better than fair negotiation when it came to forcing out resistant owners. Our case was turning into a kind of test to see just how far organized neighborhood harassment could go before law enforcement had to step in to defend constitutional property rights. Elaine wasn't just bending HOA guidelines anymore. She was outright breaking the law. That weekend, we dug into what we'd uncovered about her harassment strategy, and what we found was far more serious than simple disagreements over community rules. On Saturday morning, Emily spent hours calling different county departments, only to confirm that neither Jerry Morrison nor Mark Stevens had any connection to a legitimate agency with authority to inspect private property for safety or compliance issues. She also discovered that pretending to be a government official isn't just a local offense, it's a federal crime. That meant Elaine had crossed a dangerous line, moving from irritating neighbor harassment into potential felony territory. I wasn't sure if she grasped the legal consequences of her actions, but I knew we had to start carefully documenting everything in case this turned into a federal case with serious criminal charges. Then Monday morning brought Elaine's boldest and most reckless move yet. She showed up at our cabin at 8:10 a.m. with 2 men dressed in what looked like official uniforms. She introduced them as municipal compliance officers there to deliver urgent legal paperwork concerning our property. The taller one called himself Agent Martinez and claimed our cabin had been reported for multiple safety violations that required an immediate court-ordered review and possible compliance proceedings. His partner, Agent Davis, handed me what looked exactly like an official court order demanding that we appear before a municipal judge within 72 hours to address alleged safety and property maintenance violations that supposedly endangered both neighbors and the lake's environment. The papers looked entirely authentic: official seals, professional formatting, even citations of municipal codes we had supposedly broken. Martinez warned that if we failed to appear in court, an automatic judgment would be issued against our property, possibly leading to seizure proceedings to protect community interests. Meanwhile, Davis photographed himself delivering the documents, making it look like formal proof of service had been completed according to judicial requirements. Panic hit me immediately. If a court truly seized our property, Robert Collins's development project could move forward easily and legally, removing our opposition without the need for ongoing harassment. Emily asked to review the papers more closely, and something about the quality of the paper and the formatting made her suspicious. Before she became a teacher, she had worked as a paralegal and was familiar with the look and structure of genuine court orders. She quickly noticed irregularities. The case numbers didn't match municipal court standards, and the judge's signature didn't resemble any she had seen from our county. Emily then asked Martinez for further identification and official contact information so she could verify the hearing with the clerk's office. I could see him start to sweat as she pressed him with detailed questions about legal procedure. That's when Emily made the phone call that exposed Elaine's most brazen fraud yet. She dialed the municipal court number printed on the documents and asked to confirm the scheduled hearing and case number. After a few minutes on hold, the chief clerks came on the line and told her no case had ever been filed against our property and that the case number didn't exist in their system. The clerk also confirmed that no one named Martinez or Davis worked for the municipal court or had any authority to serve documents or represent legal proceedings. Emily thanked her, hung up, and her face shifted to pure fury as she realized Elaine had just attempted to terrorize us with entirely fabricated legal authority. As Emily turned to confront the imposters about their fraudulent papers, a local news cameraman appeared out of nowhere and started filming. It was obvious to me that Elaine had tipped off the press, hoping to catch footage of us being served and make it look like we were guilty of major violations requiring court action. The cameraman had clearly been primed for a dramatic scene, angling his camera to capture Emily's reaction as the fake agents handed over the supposed court order, but Emily caught on fast. She raised her voice, declaring for the camera that the documents were completely fake and that Martinez and Davis were impersonating municipal officials. A serious crime. She then called the municipal court office again on speakerphone so everyone present could hear the clerk confirm there was no such case and no such agents. By now, several neighbors had gathered, listening to every word. The cameraman, realizing he had been duped into recording a fraud instead of a legitimate legal action, stopped filming. Martinez and Davis bolted to their vehicle, desperate to escape before more witnesses arrived. Elaine, however, was left standing frozen in our driveway, her elaborate scheme unraveling in front of neighbors and the media alike. When she realized that her attempt to publicly disgrace us had instead exposed her own criminal behavior to the entire community and possibly even to television coverage, the fake agents panicked. They dropped the counterfeit court papers and equipment as they fled our property, leaving behind incriminating evidence that Emily immediately secured for possible prosecution. I took photographs of everything while Emily collected the abandoned items, which included forged judicial letterhead and phony municipal seals. These weren't signs of a misunderstanding about authority. They proved deliberate and organized fraud. Roughly half an hour later, Detective Morrison arrived, having been contacted by Sheriff Anderson after Emily reported the ongoing federal crime. The detective gathered the evidence and explained that impersonating court officers carried penalties even more severe than posing as local inspectors. Elaine wasn't just twisting HOA rules. She was fabricating court authority. That weekend gave us time to dig into what we had uncovered about Elaine's escalating harassment. What we found showed this was far beyond petty HOA disputes over community rules. On Saturday morning, Emily spent hours calling various county offices to confirm that none of Elaine's so-called officials belonged to any legitimate agency authorized to inspect private property for safety violations. She also learned that pretending to be a government official is a federal crime, not just a local offense, which meant Elaine had crossed into potentially felony territory. I wasn't sure if Elaine understood the gravity of her actions, but I knew we needed to start documenting everything with precision in case the matter escalated into federal court, involving serious charges of systematic fraud and intimidation. Then, on Monday morning, Elaine made her boldest move yet, delivered, right to our doorstep like a nightmare dressed in legal paperwork. Emily found a notice taped to our cabin door that appeared to be an official lien demanding $8,400 in accumulated HOA fines, penalties, and administrative fees. It warned that failure to pay would trigger property seizure proceedings. The document carried elaborate county letterhead, official-looking seals, and detailed legal wording about lien placement and foreclosure timelines. At first glance, it seemed authentic. Emily called me outside, and together we spread the notice across the kitchen table like investigators piecing together a fraud case. It listed dozens of supposed violations we'd never been informed of, retroactive fines for deck repairs, shoreline use, and community compliance issues dating back 6 months before we even inherited the property. As Emily scrutinized the formatting, she spotted small but telling inconsistencies compared to genuine county stationery, like mismatched fonts and misplaced seals, clear signs of professional forgery. She photographed every detail while I called the county clerk's office to confirm whether any liens had actually been filed. The clerk verified that nothing existed in their records and confirmed the notice was a complete fabrication, created with stolen county letterhead and forged signatures. That's when Emily decided to fight back publicly. She organized a live stream to reveal Elaine's fraud to the entire neighborhood. On our deck, with the lake as a backdrop, she set up her laptop, making the broadcast resemble a serious news report about criminal activity in our community. She invited neighbors through social media, promising to expose how fraudulent documents were being used to harass families and steal property under the guise of government authority. I helped her arrange the forged lien notice and fake inspection. Credentials on easels so the camera could capture every detail of Elaine's scheme. During the broadcast, Emily went piece by piece, exposing each falsified document while explaining how ordinary families could defend themselves against such criminal harassment. She displayed the forged letterhead, counterfeit seals, and bogus case numbers while neighbors tuned in live from their homes across the lake. She stressed that confirming case numbers with actual court offices takes only a few minutes and could save families from falling victim to fabricated debt and property seizure threats. The livestream drew over 300 viewers, including people from nearby communities who shared their own encounters with questionable HOA enforcement and suspicious legal paperwork, possibly connected to similar scams. In the middle of the broadcast, Detective Morrison arrived. She had been monitoring our situation as part of a widening investigation into organized property fraud across the region. Reviewing the forged lien notice, she addressed the livestream audience directly, explaining that forging county letterhead was a serious federal offense requiring FBI investigation. Detective Morrison made it clear. Our case was no longer just neighborhood harassment. It was evidence of a coordinated criminal conspiracy involving multiple federal crimes aimed at stealing valuable property through fraud and intimidation. She confirmed that federal agents would expand their investigation to include any families who had received similar documents or been pressured by HOA officials posing as government authorities. Emily ended the live stream by urging neighbors to come forward with any suspicious legal documents or coercive tactics they had experienced from HOA leadership, especially anything disguised as government enforcement or unusual legal procedures. Several neighbors quickly reached out to Detective Morrison, sharing nearly identical experiences of fake violation notices and bogus fines that had forced them into costly, unnecessary repairs or changes to their properties. It became clear to me that Emily's decision to publicly expose Elaine's tactics had sparked a wider community awakening to a pattern of systematic fraud that had long been disguised as routine HOA enforcement, left unchecked for years. That same evening, Detective Morrison called with an update that completely shifted both our legal standing and Elaine's exposure to federal prosecution. The federal case had now widened to include conspiracy charges, and the forged lien documents Elaine had created were being treated as direct evidence of ongoing criminal activity aimed at stealing property through fraudulent legal intimidation. Morrison explained that falsifying documents on government letterhead often points to organized crime rather than isolated harassment, suggesting Elaine and Robert might be tied to a much larger criminal network active across multiple neighborhoods. She cautioned that Elaine could grow more desperate as federal scrutiny tightened, possibly escalating to direct threats or property damage. Though Elaine had threatened us with property seizure, Morrison assured us that federal surveillance was already underway. The following Friday afternoon, something unexpected landed in our mailbox. Emily discovered a notice announcing an emergency HOA meeting set for Sunday evening, supposedly to address urgent safety violations and ongoing non-compliance issues. The notice singled out our cabin by address, alleging that community members were deeply concerned about its supposed effect on neighborhood safety and property values. Emily read it aloud as we sat together on the deck, her voice edged with frustration. Elaine was now using official HOA channels and public pressure to try to isolate us from the rest of the community. Saturday became our preparation day. We knew Elaine planned to leverage formal HOA procedures to succeed where her campaign of fraudulent harassment had failed. Emily devoted the morning to building a presentation that laid out a clear timeline of Elaine's illegal activities, exposing her escalating criminal behavior across several weeks. She prepared copies of 911 call recordings, photographs of fake credentials, and evidence of government impersonation for neighbors who might not yet understand what had been happening behind the scenes. Together, we built a presentation designed to educate the community about how criminal fraud had been masquerading as neighborhood protection. By Sunday evening, the community center was more crowded than I'd ever seen in the 3 years since we inherited the cabin from my grandfather. Elaine had clearly worked hard to draw a large turnout for what was essentially a trial against us. She had transformed the room into something resembling a courtroom, our cabin blown up in photographs displayed on easels, violation charts plastered on bulletin boards, and stacks of falsified inspection reports handed out like evidence packets. It was staged like a prosecution case, meant to convince neighbors that our cabin was a serious hazard requiring immediate action. Elaine began her presentation with a dramatic claim that our cabin had become a danger to the community because we had resisted legitimate HOA oversight and refused professional safety inspections. Gesturing toward the photographs and charts, she delivered what sounded like a rehearsed prosecution speech, painting us as non-compliant and hostile toward community standards. She accused us of putting families at risk through our refusal to accept proper authority. Some neighbors even nodded in agreement, seemingly swayed by her polished presentation and detailed charts. That's when Emily rose to speak. With a quiet confidence I rarely saw in her, she asked to share our side of the story. Elaine tried to block her, insisting the meeting was only for HOA business, but the crowd pushed back, demanding to hear from us before any vote was taken. Emily connected her laptop to the audio system and told everyone she wanted them to hear Elaine's own words to 911 dispatchers. With a single click, Elaine's voice filled the room, describing routine lock replacement as criminal vandalism that required multiple police units. The reaction was instant and devastating. Neighbors looked stunned as they heard Elaine blatantly lie to emergency dispatchers, twisting a simple repair into a manufactured crime scene. Emily paused the recording at the most incriminating point and calmly explained that filing false reports with 911 isn't a community matter. It's a federal offense. She resumed playback, and when Elaine mentioned Robert's development company, the mood in the room shifted sharply. People realized they had been misled into backing a campaign of harassment aimed at seizing property for profit, not protecting community safety. Emily continued, showing photographs of the fake inspector IDs and fraudulent legal documents. Step by step, she laid out how Elaine had escalated from abusing 911 calls to impersonating government officials, serious crimes carrying federal weight. She displayed the forged lien notice and bogus municipal letters, pointing out the techniques used to terrorize families with fake legal authority. For the first time, Elaine looked small and powerless as neighbors studied the evidence and then turned their eyes back to her. Several people who had signed her petition against us began apologizing, angry that they had been manipulated into supporting criminal behavior they never would have condoned knowingly. At that moment, Detective Morrison entered with 2 federal agents who had been observing from outside. She announced to the room that the FBI had been monitoring Elaine Collins for organized fraud and that the night's meeting was being recorded as evidence for federal prosecution. The room fell silent as Morrison explained that the investigation was targeting a broader conspiracy of fake authority schemes used to intimidate families across the region. What had started as a hostile HOA meeting had just transformed into the opening move of a federal takedown. The following Thursday morning, while Emily and I sat on the deck eating breakfast and watching the sunrise, federal agents arrived at our cabin. Agent Williams from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division introduced herself, explaining that the scope of crimes placed our case squarely under federal jurisdiction. With her was Agent Rodriguez from the Department of Justice, ADE, specialist in prosecuting abuse of emergency services and fraudulent authority schemes. They spread thick folders across our kitchen table, evidence we had provided, and told us they had rarely seen such a thoroughly documented case of organized harassment spanning multiple federal crimes over such an extended period. Emily presented them with our full timeline of criminal activity, beginning with the staged 911 call and moving step by step through every fake inspector incident, backed up by photos and audio evidence. Agent Rodriguez focused closely on how the crimes escalated, pointing out that impersonation schemes often begin on a small scale and then progress into more serious offenses as the offenders grow bolder and more reckless. He explained that Elaine's move from impersonating local inspectors to producing falsified court papers demonstrated not confusion or misplaced concern for community protection, but clear awareness of guilt and deliberate, planned criminal conduct. The agents spent 3 hours going through our documentation and confirmed they had more than enough material to pursue federal charges that could bring heavy prison sentences for everyone involved in the conspiracy. That's when Agent Williams shared something that shook me more than anything else up to that point. The FBI had secretly been investigating HOA corruption in our region for over a year, following complaints from several communities about fraudulent authority figures and intimidation schemes designed to force property sales. Our ordeal wasn't just a case of neighbor harassment. Elaine and Robert Collins had been using the same tactics in at least 4 other lakefront communities, systematically targeting homeowners with harassment campaigns until they gave in and sold their properties rather than endure drawn-out legal fights against fabricated government authority. Federal investigators had already been tracking their operation for months, but until we turned over our records, they lacked the solid evidence needed to move forward with prosecution. Emily asked how many other families had fallen victim to Elaine's criminal schemes. Agent Rodriguez replied that at least 12 properties had been taken this way over the past 3 years. Most of those homeowners had chosen to sell and leave, rather than attempt the kind of research and evidence gathering we had done. As a result, Elaine had been able to funnel millions of dollars worth of valuable lakefront land into her husband's luxury development projects through illegal means. Our decision to resist, document everything, and hand it over to authorities had finally given law enforcement the proof required to shut down their fraudulent enterprise and pursue charges. Then, Agent Rodriguez proposed something that sent a mix of dread and adrenaline through me. They wanted Emily and me to help in a controlled sting operation aimed at catching Elaine in the act, with federal agents using professional-grade equipment to capture every detail for court. He laid out the plan. A fake property transfer meeting, staged to look as though we had finally given in to the pressure and were ready to sell our cabin to Robert's development company. Our role was to follow a carefully written script that would allow Elaine to incriminate herself while federal equipment recorded every exchange, guaranteeing strong evidence for convictions. On Wednesday morning, Emily and I sat in our cabin's living room following Agent Williams' script as advanced federal recording gear captured our staged phone call to Elaine. Emily told her we were exhausted from the constant HOA harassment and were now ready to talk about selling to Robert's company rather than face more legal trouble over alleged violations. Elaine's excitement was unmistakable, even over the phone. She immediately agreed to come by that afternoon with Robert and their legal team to start negotiations. Emily and I exchanged a look across the room, fully aware that we were about to walk into a federal sting operation that could either expose Elaine completely or put us at serious risk. That afternoon, Elaine showed up with Robert and 2 men she introduced as federal compliance officers, supposedly there to supervise the transfer and make sure it met all legal standards. During the staged negotiations, Emily and I purposely acted worn down and desperate, explaining that we couldn't afford to endure more harassment and wanted to sell quickly to avoid any additional trouble from HOA enforcement or federal investigation. Robert drafted official-looking contracts while his counterfeit federal agents snapped photos and took measurements, producing records that gave the false impression of lawful government oversight and a legitimate property acquisition. I saw Elaine's triumphant smile, convinced that her campaign of harassment had finally worn us down and forced us to give up our family inheritance under the weight of intimidation and fraudulent authority. The imposter agents then began describing supposed transfer procedures, while Elaine pushed hard for us to sign immediately, insisting that any delay would bring added penalties and more legal trouble from an ongoing federal probe into alleged property violations. Robert presented a purchase offer far below market value, claiming our cabin's worth had been reduced by community disputes and supposed legal issues, which he said justified discounted pricing to cover development costs and regulatory hurdles. Emily appeared distraught and overwhelmed, asking again and again about protection from continued harassment and potential liability. Elaine reassured her that selling to Robert's company would wipe away every problem, ending community conflict and blocking any future government interference with our property. That was the moment Agent Williams emerged from behind the cabin, with 3 real federal officers loudly declaring that everyone present was under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and for a campaign of criminal harassment aimed at seizing property through organized intimidation. Elaine's look of victory instantly shifted into sheer terror as she realized the meeting was in fact a federal sting operation targeting her scheme. Agent Rodriguez recited Elaine's rights as Robert and his fake agents were handcuffed and restrained. Their fraudulent paperwork and equipment were seized as proof of an ongoing conspiracy tied to multiple federal crimes against families across our region. The professional raid lasted under 10 minutes, yet it felt like years of harassment collapsing in a single decisive strike by federal law enforcement. Watching Elaine cut off mid-celebration, arrested on our deck as if in a crime thriller rather than our quiet lakeside community, was almost surreal. Emily and I stood together as the perpetrators were led away in chains after months of calculated intimidation designed to steal our inheritance under the guise of fake government authority. Couldn't stop thinking how the nightmare had started with nothing more than Emily changing a $20 gate lock, and now it had culminated in federal arrests tied to multi-million-dollar property fraud and a coordinated criminal conspiracy. Agent Williams later explained that the sting had captured flawless evidence of systematic fraud and intimidation, exposing Roberts hired federal officers as imposters brought in solely to scare us into surrendering our rights. Emily asked about broader charges tied to the development project, and Agent Rodriguez confirmed the probe had expanded to include conspiracy counts related to organized campaigns of harassment used to break property owners' resistance to luxury. Developments built on fraud and intimidation. The full scope of Elaine and Robert's operation would only be revealed in court. The federal courthouse was strangely calm for a case of such weight, systematic fraud and years of harassment targeting numerous families. From the public gallery, Emily and I watched as Elaine Collins and her husband Robert faced sweeping charges: conspiracy, impersonating federal officers, abusing 911 services, and orchestrating fraud to take property through intimidation. Their attorney had plainly urged plea deals, knowing the evidence gathered by Agent Williams' team was overwhelming and would almost certainly secure the harshest possible sentences. Emily squeezed my hand while Judge Thompson reviewed the charges, stressing the gravity of abusing false federal authority to pressure citizens and seize valuable property through organized criminal tactics. Elaine's plea hearing unveiled the full extent of her scheme. Over 3 years, she had led harassment campaigns against 12 families, deploying fake government personnel and forged credentials to push them into selling below market value to Robert's company. The fraud netted more than $8 million in illicit property acquisitions built on manufactured authority and fear-driven coercion that convinced victims they were dealing with government enforcement instead of a criminal ring. Prosecutor Morrison laid out extensive evidence showing how Elaine had leveraged 2 decades as a city clerk to craft convincing false credentials and official-looking paperwork. Emily delivered a moving victim impact statement, linking our family's simple $20 lock replacement to defending her grandfather's legacy and safeguarding our constitutional property rights against a ruthless system of intimidation and fraud. She stood at the witness stand, facing Judge Thompson directly as she spoke. Your Honor, this woman twisted my attempt to repair a broken lock into a federal crime scene. Her goal was simple. She wanted to steal the cabin my grandfather built, with his own 2 hands 4 decades ago. She made me fear maintaining my own inheritance, convincing me that even the smallest repair would bring fake government agents to my door, threatening arrest, threatening to seize my property, all under a false authority designed to frighten families into surrendering their constitutional rights. Emily's voice cracked as she described the emotional toll of repeated harassment disguised as so-called community protection. When it was my turn to speak, I shared the bizarre experience of watching my wife nearly get arrested for something as ordinary as fixing a lock, and how that absurd moment unraveled into the discovery of widespread criminal fraud across our entire region. I told Judge Thompson, Your Honor, my grandfather taught me that maintaining land is both a duty and a privilege, not something that should trigger police sirens or federal investigations. Elaine Collins had turned basic property upkeep into a campaign of harassment because she couldn't take our family inheritance through honest negotiation or fair business. Instead, she weaponized government authority against families who trusted community leaders and believed in lawful process, until her criminal scheme forced us to study federal law ourselves just to defend our basic rights. Judge Thompson delivered the sentences with a finality that drew gasps across the courtroom. Elaine was given 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, along with full restitution to every family she had victimized. Robert received 2 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud, complete forfeiture of all criminally obtained properties, and the permanent dissolution of Lakefront Development Solutions. The judge explained that impersonating government, official strikes at the very foundation of public trust and cannot be brushed off as a business dispute, especially when it's part of a scheme of systematic fraud fueled by intimidation and the stripping away of constitutional property rights. Other families testified, sharing stories of nearly identical harassment. Mrs. Helen Parker described how fake environmental inspectors pressured her into selling her cottage for half its value to avoid fabricated penalties. The Johnson family recounted paying for needless repairs before being driven to leave altogether just to escape ongoing intimidation. Each story highlighted the predatory nature of Elaine's operation, targeting families who believed in community leadership and trusted government authority. The gavel's final strike echoed through the courthouse, marking the end of years of criminal oppression masked as legitimate oversight. Emily and I stepped into the bright sunlight, relieved that federal prosecution had not only safeguarded our inheritance but also dismantled an organized criminal network. We drove to our cabin, where Emily installed her custom gate lock. Attached to it was a brass plaque that gleamed in the afternoon sun, engraved Reed Family Property, protected by federal court order. Judge Thompson ordered restitution exceeding $2 million, funded by forfeited properties and dissolved company assets, to cover legal expenses and damages for harassment. Arrest her. She destroyed community property. That's what Elaine Collins screamed to the police while my wife stood holding nothing but a new padlock. She had only replaced the rusty old lock on our own gate, our cabin, our land. Yet somehow flashing lights and sirens bounced across. The lake and neighbors looked on as if we were criminals. My stomach twisted. I didn't know whether to laugh at the absurdity or scream at the injustice. What would you have done if your spouse was treated like a criminal just for fixing a lock? The memory replays in my head, still unreal. Emily clutched the broken lock dangling by a rusted piece of metal, as if it were Exhibit A in some mock trial. Elaine stood red-faced, playing Queen of the Lake, trying to turn a $20 hardware store fix into grounds for arrest. One officer rolled his eyes, clearly aware he'd been dragged into a circus instead of a crime scene, but the humiliation still cut deep. What hurt the most wasn't just the sirens or Elaine's performance. It was the way strangers slowed their cars, whispering like we were guilty of something shameful. My wife kept looking at me, silently asking if this nightmare was actually happening or if it was some twisted prank. Looking back, it's unbelievable how one simple lock change triggered a chain of sirens, paperwork, and threats that only grew. Darker from there, what began as maintenance became the spark that revealed Elaine's larger scheme, something she never imagined we'd fight back against. That night etched itself into my memory as a warning that this wasn't going away quietly. Maybe that's why it still lingers, the way a petty grudge escalated into a full-blown attack on our peace, our dignity, and even our right to feel safe in the home my grandfather built. Maybe the real takeaway is this: people who crave control will keep pushing until someone finally pushes back. If you've read this far, I'd love to hear in the comments. How would you handle a neighbor like this? And if you'd like to support the channel, you can always hit the thanks button below. Stay sharp, protect what's yours, and never let anyone rewrite the rules at your own front gate.